Playing for a color strategy in chess is an advanced strategic concept, and after watching this video you will be able to understand it and apply it in your own games. So this is a game between two players, very strong, around 2400, playing with white, and 2600 grandmaster from India playing with the black pieces, and he's the guy who applied a color strategy in, I would say, very excellent way. That's why I want to show this game and yeah, give it to you as a prime example of how to use color strategy in chess. So as always, chances arise when your opponent misunderstands something or is doing some mistake, and so we start after white did this mistake, bishop takes d4. This might not look like a mistake at first, as white is winning a pawn here and the black knight is pinned for the moment, as the bishop on g7 would drop, so there are no discoveries. Furthermore, it might even look like black has another weakness on d6, so white has not just won a pawn, but also isolated this pawn on d6. However, that's not quite the truth, and black will get a lot of counterplay, and all that is based on the power of this dark square bishop, which is now unopposed because there is no longer this bishop on e3, and black thus has a superiority on the dark squares. And this will give him huge counterplay, as this bishop is really active, exerting pressure on the queen, on the center, and even the b2 pawn. So black just castled. I'm saying this is long-term compensation. My bishop will make up for the missing pawn. And also black introduces the threat of knight takes d5 now, as the bishop on g7 is now protected by the king, and the queen would not be able to take on g7, nor would the queen be able to take on d5. Also note that black has a lead in development and already developed all his pieces, while white is still stuck in the center with the king. So white, being a pawn up, decided to play queen to b6, trying to get the queens off and reaching an endgame with an extra pawn. Fair enough, but black played a very classical move for a color strategy game, which is adding even more imbalance to the color power in the game. In this position, basically the difference between white and black is black has this dark square bishop and white has a knight. So as I was once talking about it in a previous video, a bishop is like a complete power of one color, so it's worth 3 points, and it's a minor piece with a strength of 3, so this is like basically 3 units of dark squared force. And a knight is hopping on dark squares and white squares both, so it's just half a light square piece and half a dark square piece. So this is just 1.5 points of dark square force and 1.5 points of light square force. So black's superiority on the dark squares is 1.5 units. And by trading this light square bishop, which has a force of 3 points on the light squares but 0 on dark squares, trading this against this knight reduces the dark square power of white. And that's why I think this is an excellent move, because now black is saying this bishop is even more unopposed to fight for the dark squares, because now the difference is not bishop versus knight but bishop versus bishop, and thus black has even more superiority on the dark squares, as this bishop on f1 has a strength of 3 on the light squares but 0 on the dark squares. So the advantage on the dark squares has grown from 1.5 advantage to an advantage of 3 units. And so black really dominates on the dark squares. And that's a key theme you see in color strategy games, that this one bishop having the superior scope really outplays the opponent, sometimes even by itself. Just look at this bishop. This bishop will be locked in by the own pawns, doesn't have any scope, and so the black bishop is just way, way better. So now white traded queens, black took, white took. Looks solid, but black increases the initiative, and this happens due to the more active pieces and the better development. White can still defend against everything, but black just has so good long-term compensation. Just goes b5, and after castle. He does not rush with anything, but just plays knight to d7, which I think is an excellent move. Just showing that even being a pawn down, this bishop is so good. White cannot really move the knight. White cannot really move the rook. And this pawn on e4, it won't go anywhere. This e5 square is under black's control forever. And also the c5 square is a very nice square to improve the position even further. Black can just pile up, and we see white has no chance fighting for those dark squares in the center because he just has the wrong piece, which is the bishop on d3. Just not able to fight for it. So knight d7 is a very nice move in my opinion, because black is really using those dark squares where he has access, and those pieces also do not longer stand in each other's way here. They have much better harmony on d7 and g7 rather than on f6 and g7. So after this, white dropped back the bishop. Logical move, because the knight might hit it at some point in the future, but now black improved his pieces further, again not rushing to regain anything. Rook c5. The knight again cannot move because this bishop is so powerful and would always take the b2 pawn. So f4 played, check, and rook c8. Already now black might be able to regain the pawn, but maybe he should not be in a rush and instead try to even maximize the pressure, the dark squared advantage, because this bishop is so strong that we do not want to give it away, but rather increase the pressure first. We would like to take a pawn, but maybe not at the cost of giving the bishop. So after rook c to e1, black was not rushing to take on c3. And I can show you why this might not be so great. Of course, black is better here, but after e5, white also activates his bishop and also gets his pawns into motion. And this is something which could never be possible if there was the black bishop, because we could just take on e5 twice. But now there is this counterplay because we kind of lost a bit of control on the dark squares. So instead, black did not rush, but activated his knight. So if white played e5 instead, here there is a difference because the knight is already on b6. We have different targets as well, like the d5 pawn, and we don't need to capture on c3 immediately, as c3 will be gone anyways, but we can instead trade on e5 and grab the pawn on d5. With a lot of weak pawns remaining, black is a lot better here. So white instead tried knight d1, trying to hold on to all the material, but the activity is just too much. After knight b6, knight d1, rook c1 came, and after knight c3, black finally won the pawn. Here it's no longer possible to go to the back rank. I think this pin is very annoying, and all the pieces incoming, it's just too much. In fact, here black might win the pawn immediately. But maybe also just guard his a5 pawn first, as I doubt that this position can really be survived. There are just too many threats. Maybe black will also just collect the a2 pawn with the rook and then have a lot of dangerous queenside pawns. So instead knight e2 played, but after that black won this pawn, and after a5 the black pawns get into motion, and it is very likely that after a4, b3 and pawn to a3 there will be a strong passer. Meanwhile, the white pawn in the center is well controlled, as again it's hard to cross the dark squares, and thus this pawn is really not so useful. There came rook b1 and bishop to f6, trade of the rooks, but now after a4 white was a bit desperate, giving up the e4 pawn, which was probably a good choice, as after king to e3 black would win a piece with this breakthrough on the queen side, and since this pawn can be stopped in a comfortable way, black is just a piece up and the knight will also get out. So that's why white gave back the pawn on e4, controlling the passers on the queen side, but black had a huge advantage here, and that's also the point where we will stop. The color strategy was successful here. It comes down to conversion, but black has not only regained the pawn but has won a pawn in the process, and he was never in the danger of losing, as his activity and his dominance on the dark squares always kept his position very safe. The pawn on e4 was never threatening to go anywhere, and in the long term he could use his initiative and dominance to win back the missing material with interest. So that's it about this color strategy example. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments, and I'm happy to see you in the next video. Goodbye.